We can start. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the District Plan Review Subcommittee meeting. Welcome to those in chambers who are with us and anyone who is watching online. We do have apologies this morning from the Mayor and Councillor Linwood. Does someone want to move that we accept those apologies? Thank you, Councillor McCone. Seconded, Councillor Blackler. All those in favour, say aye. Carried. I just note, is there anyone wishing to declare any conflicts of interest? There is none. So we move on to the decision report from Mr. Campbell. But prior to delivering that, I'll ask you to introduce our new staff member as well, please, David.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on my left is our new Senior Planner, Mike Butler. He's replaced Rachel, who's now at Mackenzie District Council across the Rotorua. So yeah, Mike's come from us from a range of experience, mainly up north, but he's moved down south. So he's joined the team and helping with the response to queries on the proposed plan. And yeah, down the track, we'll be working on it as we go through.
Thank you.
Right. Shall I carry on to the?
Yes, please.
Yep. So I guess a couple of things with this report is one, it's brought to you because the subcommittee in previous meetings have raised a few things for us to look at. And as well as that, our staff, particularly the consents planners and policy team members, have picked up a few little things as we work through it, mainly to improve and tidy up minor matters in the plan. They're not substantive by any means. In terms of the staff recommendations. And we also note that any of these provisions can be submitted on. So it's not preempting what an outcome will be. It's just saying, hey, can we tidy things up now? Noting that people are likely to submit on some of these down the track. So I don't think that we're creating a change that's going to be stuck forever. It'll be one that gets reconsidered like all submissions through the process. We've got the table of commentary there on each one, and hopefully it's easy enough to follow. So I'm guided by you how you want to work through that. We've got quite a bit of time, but I don't think, given the substance of many of them, we don't need to spend long on them. One or two may require a little bit more rework, or some have been flagged for just a bit more information prior to going to council. These obviously have to get a council sign off under delegation to be lodged as a submission, which is scheduled for the 29th of April council meeting. So we do have a wee bit of time, noting the agenda close off for that, be a week out.
Yes.
From the 29th. So some of those, particularly around the heritage matters, will be better informed for that meeting, and you'll see it ahead of the meeting anyway. So if you have any questions on those, you can raise them before the meeting to say, hey, I have a sort of concern about this or not. But it's really just to say what we recommend here. If it's cut and dry, straight to the council meeting. If there's some that need a wee bit of thought or rework, we can incorporate that into the report to council. So it doesn't all have to be decided today.
Well,
Respect.
Just to clarify, these will have to go to the council meeting in April to get approval meet the submission deadline.
What I propose to do is that we'll work through the list. There are another couple of matters that we would like to raise, and I'll ask members to hold on to those till we've completed this first process. So if we head across to page 10. And the first one is dealing with the definition of agricultural intensification. Councillor Hopkins.
Okay, so I think this is one that we asked for on the basis, amongst other things, that the Crown and various ministers had signalled a commitment to irrigation and the use of water as an important part of productive systems and the operation and function of the primary sector. What has disappointed me about some of the staff submissions that we are going to be considering this morning is essentially there continues to be, it seems to me, a reluctance, I'd almost say intransigence, with regard to actually accepting that there is an attitude, an appetite for and an intention to change. And my view is that the difficulty with the approach throughout what we're going to be discussing this morning is we're saying this, and if other people don't like it, they can submit. So the primacy of approach seems to be that, you know, our view stands and everyone else can argue with that. Whereas I would submit that in the light of what is now clear and timetabled, and you and I and others, including the planning manager, have participated in briefings and conversations about the changes, the detail and particularity of those is now much clearer. And the date at which the actual text of the two bills is also very close. September is the deadline for the one that's the significant one. Given all of that, I would argue that we should not accept this officer's submission, and we should require a revisiting of the definition in respect of its references to irrigation, because it seems to me that the definition that we have in front of us today reflects an attitude largely fashioned during the time, if you like, of the previous government, when you had a series of national policy statements and other directives that clearly signalled a direction of travel that has now been revoked. And the difficulty with the definition is this definition, in my view, is it's yesterday's definition. And whereas I don't necessarily have an absolute set of words, and I'd be possibly reluctant to simply remove references to irrigation completely, I certainly think that reference to irrigation being essentially problematic, along with any switch from irrigated crop and seed production to dairy farming, continues to need to be rethought.
Councillor McCann.
I totally endorse what Jim's saying, and I think that was highlighted in Sidney's ODT where they quoted the late Sid Hurst. So as a practical example, we've gone from a dust bowl in the 80s to an irrigation system out in the plains in the 90s to deer farming, sheep farming, and to dairying now, and we're also now looking at horticulture. So in a 50-year time span, of which probably the last 30 have seen most changes in intensive agriculture out there, I don't think we can define what's written in here as definition, because the farming or the rural district relies on what is best for its return on the land. And they follow the markets, but they also look after the land while they're doing it. And I think we're being too specific.
Mr. Campbell?
Yeah, thank you, councillors. I guess the signal changes go two ways in the sense that some of these matters may well end up at a higher level, including landscapes. The SASM area has been identified as sort of being dealt with regionally as well as biodiversity. Aside from that, we tried to narrow the scope of when the definition would apply to those matters. So it is quite restrictive. And you would have to have areas, firstly, not irrigated in those covered by those three topics. And secondly, there is a consent process if you wanted to extend onto any of those areas. A lot of the plains and areas already have irrigation, so it doesn't affect those that are converting land use per se, other than that change from irrigated crop and seed production to dairy farming, which has a different set of effects. The other aspect to the reform is that the water allocation regime that we currently now have, as Councillor Hopkins points out, is a yesterday problem, but it's going to be changed so that it's not a first in, first served, and some of the consumptive takes, such as irrigation, are probably going to be dialed back in some areas. I'm not saying here, but in some areas of the country they might. So effectively what we're saying is we've pared the definition back to what it was. We've noted the concerns around the already productive land that's not affected by those three kind of categories and specifically listed them in the definition so it's clear. Aside from that, if we pared it back anymore, it would almost disappear in terms of a notion. So we'd have to think about, we're trying to have a consent trigger for agricultural intensification where it affects those three categories, the SASMs, biodiversity and landscapes. Aside from irrigation, what else would we put in there to be a trigger for agricultural intensification? And this is, again, only where it's not irrigated land. And there's probably not many scenarios where additional irrigation would be on those areas, particularly the landscape ones where they're generally steeper faces or features that are less able to be irrigated. But it doesn't mean people can't apply for consent to it. It's just a trigger to say, hey, we want to look at these things and consider the effects, even if it's just on the fringe of a feature or an area.
I think that my understanding and recollection of what the committee was talking about previously is we wanted to move away from that prescriptive space that related all intensification to irrigation. There are a whole raft of other options that would be classed as intensification. And we also wanted to acknowledge that the technology available today in the irrigation space is so far away from the hillbilly days of border dikes and flood irrigation that there's the opportunity to be very prescriptive in terms of soil measurements, amount of water going on, the old legislation tended to think of irrigation as a bogey, and the subcommittee didn't share that view. Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I would endorse those comments, and I'd go a wee bit further. I have two questions I'd like to ask. Well, a question and a comment. I'll make the comment first. It does occur to me that we could actually almost question the need for any reference to agricultural intensification whatsoever. Because if we think about the briefing at the Planning Institute meeting in Invercargill that elected members received, and I think my understanding is that planners and planning managers and staff actually received a more comprehensive and even more detailed briefing. But if we think about what the MFE speakers at that event told us, the intention of the changes is, and I quote from the information they put on screen, the intention is to narrow the scope of the resource management system and the effects it controls, with the enjoyment of property rights the guiding principle. Now, if we apply that sentence to this definition, I would argue that it actually, that sentence renders the definition unnecessary. And it could actually, I mean, I could mount an argument for saying that if indeed the legislation in its particularity reflects that statement, that you would simply remove this, it would eliminate the need for this particular definition and area of concern to be incorporated in our plan. So that's the comment, over and above the comments you made about the punitive attitude towards irrigation per se. The other question I have is a general one, and it may relate to the matters that you said we would discuss later. I take it that if we agree to all or any of these officer recommendations today, they can be incorporated in the currently notified plan without there being any particular consequences in relation to challenges about its content. And clearly, if that is the case, does that indicate that other possible changes could also be incorporated on the same basis?
Mr. Campbell?
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. Any submission lodged will go into the mix with all submissions and can be further submitted on, and then it's considered by a hearings panel, so it doesn't get changed automatically. It's treated as any other submission. It's just coming from the council itself.
But you're in this, I mean, let's say we said yes to this one, right, that the definition would stand. So that would be no change. But in other ones, you've got, okay, there are only grammatical changes, but there are some where you say you are recommending that the content of the plan be changed. Now, I'm assuming that that's not ultra vires. I'm assuming that the fact that you can recommend that would indicate that those changes can be made to the document currently notified without somebody saying, oi, we now need a judicial review because you've changed whatever and whatever. So that's the question I was trying to clarify.
Any changes agreed by council through this process will go into the mix with all submissions. The plan does not get altered until such time as a hearings panel make a decision on the submissions if they agree with them. So for instance, if we decided to change the agricultural intensification definition, others might submit on that as well, and the hearings panel will make a decision on the all of the submissions and the expertise given to them. So this is not a correct along the way process. It's a put it in the mix with all submissions. This one has come from the council itself. It's a submission under the RMA. It's not a correctional change made under other provisions.
So to further clarify, we are today being asked to sign off on these submissions as a recommendation to the next available council meeting, and then they will be put in the submissions pot. We're not making arbitrary decisions to change. They are open to counter challenge and counter submission in the process.
Well, I understand that, but the point I was trying to get at, and I'm still not clear in my own mind, and perhaps the public aren't either, and I apologise if I'm just obtuse and don't get it. If it is agreed, if our recommendation is, if our decision today is to recommend certain things occur, including some of the officer recommendations being incorporated in the plan. Some of them just relate to deletion of colons or the addition of, changing of words, but outstanding to the word exceptional being replaced with the word outstanding. My question is, if the council votes at its next meeting to agree to our recommendations, does the notified plan then read outstanding in respect of heritage qualities rather than exceptional?
No, the plan will stand as it was posted, and these will be submissions to change the plan. Is that correct, Mr. Campbell?
Yes, so whoever considers the change, so the example of going from exceptional to outstanding, may agree with that rewording and issue a decision to that effect. So that would be the only time it's changed, is when a decision is made on the submission, because this is a submission. Yep. So nothing gets changed until that point.
So I understand, and the public need to understand, what we're proposing today will not materially change the proposed district plan. These are submissions on our behalf to the district plan to seek change. It's all a wee bit obtuse, but so is the whole planning world. So
This is not.
I guess that,
yeah,
if I can draw another example, if this was a board, and say it was the board of Meridian Energy, and the staff were coming along saying, hey, we recommend that you make these submissions to the plan, the board, e.g. these people in this room, would say, yes, we agree with that, please lodge that as a submission, and then we have to wait to see what the decision is on that submission. So you're acting as a board effectively to endorse a submission to be made on behalf of council to largely correct things or improve things.
Okay.
Yeah, down the line they'll be considered, but nothing will be changed in the interim. Yeah.
Mr. Cook?
It's just in the same way as the council make any submission on any legislation change. Officers will draft submissions, council approve them, they go through to the system. They may or may not get incorporated when the decision is made.
There is a certain irony in that we're the elected representatives of our community, and we have to go through this process to effect change to our own planning documents. But however, Councillor Blackler.
Thank you. Just a question regarding the kind of proposed changes around, paring it back to those sensitive chapters like the biodiversity, natural features and landscapes, and SASMs. So is the idea behind that that the irrigation would apply in those chapters because they're the areas defined by the independent parties as still carrying the values that those chapters seek to preserve, whereas they've kind of, in the most part, been lost in other areas of the district.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Blackler. That's correct. I'm just looking at a rule as an example, it might help. So in the eco chapter, which covers biodiversity, for instance, there's a rule that triggers consent within an SNA for commercial forest or exotic commercial forestry, agricultural intensification, quarrying or mining, as well as joining an SNA as well. So it's basically saying there's only a subset of things we're really concerned about that might impact an SNA or landscapes, other values that are there. So those things, yeah, we know from past definitely have potential for effects on those values. That's why it's put in. Agricultural intensification, I guess, is saying it's really only that change from the non-irrigated to irrigated that is to be considered in the effects. It's not how they irrigate, that sort of thing. It's just the change of non-irrigated to irrigated. There may not be an effect in some cases, but it's just a consent trigger for those. It's not saying it won't happen.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can understand it because the evidence is pretty clear that you know, where agricultural intensification has occurred, the values that are set out in those chapters, which are required of us at this point by the legal framework, you know, essentially that's the result of intensification, is the loss of those values.
Mr. Campbell?
Yeah, I mean, there's potential there, not doing a lot of analysis on it, but the last part of the definition where it talks about change from irrigated crop and seed production to dairy farming could be something that potentially could be pared back from the definition. Because there's already irrigated land, it's just that the land use itself, which is probably more controlled by the regional council in many respects in terms of discharge, but irrigated crop and seed production does have a level of disturbance to the land anyway, so it may be something that could be taken out.
Yeah, I'd be supportive of that, because I think you're right, Mr. Campbell. You know, the main effect is what would need to fall under a more regional focus. So I don't see, you know, of the things we're trying to address at the territorial level, I don't really see like the distinguishable difference between cropping and dairy. They both would have the same impact on reduction in biodiversity, etc.
Councillor McCone?
Yeah, look, just take that further, you know, as was mentioned earlier, the ability to get more mileage out of the water that you get in your irrigation system is getting more and more technical every year, and it's getting more and more user friendly. And on that basis, there are a lot of farms out there that are sitting on the edge of irrigation or have irrigation but don't have the ability to put it into practice straight away. So when you talk about existing use, how fragile is that in the basis that they might not be able to do it for under the existing land use, might not be able to do it for 10 years, but as technology comes, can they go back in there and say, well, we now have the finances and we now have the ability under different agricultural streams to actually go and intensify this place and put irrigation on it?
Thank you, Councillor McCone. That's a good question. I guess if they've got land that's not affected by those three things, then yes, there's no restriction. So this is only saying we are affected by those overlays that you are caught to need a consent. And again, if the technology is such that it's not going to impact on those values, then consent can be granted. A bit like we do now. We've had a recent earthworks consent that some of you were discussing yesterday, and you know that went through a process. It was a significant natural feature, had advice, and consent could be granted. So it's not saying things can't happen. It's just a mechanism to make sure the effects can be tested under the RMA and district plan.
Look, I totally get that, David, but at the end of the day, there is a cost, and that cost can be horrific to get the actual job done. So what I'm trying to say is, can we make it easier before we actually start imposing those costs on the landowner?
Yeah, and again, if there's ways of avoiding some of those features or areas, that could be part of their consideration. It depends on the extent in which they are going to be irrigated or covered. So that's kind of the balance landowners have to work through. If it's really just crossing over the corner or a small part of a SASM or something like that, it may not be a huge issue. But yeah, it's case by case. Yeah.
I've got two questions, but I just want to reinforce we're going to be here all day if we're seeking to rewrite these. The proposal in front of us from staff is to pass the ball on this first one and recommend that we don't make the submission that the committee wished, and really that's the decision that we need to be dealing with today. But Councillor Blackler, and then we'll go to Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I agree. But before we move to that, I just wanted to touch on Councillor McCone's comments regarding costs, and you might be able to recall when was it that we passed the motion to put something in place to subsidise the cost of a consent application in the sensitive overlay areas. I'd just be keen to understand how that work's being progressed or how we go about shifting that to the next level.
I believe that was a request for staff to explore whether we were in a position to do that. Or I stand to be corrected.
Yes, that's correct. And Mr. Cook, I want to comment further, but it's an issue that we'd have to traverse in terms of what extent it would cover. We currently have a heritage fee waiver policy where it's very minimal in terms of cost to council ratepayers, and it's where people are, improving or maintaining heritage buildings but need consent. So, there's potentially a greater cost for spreading it across more natural and cultural values matters, and there'd be an issue around timing and how it's implemented. But it is possible. It's just how much we want to spend doing that.
I think in light of the changes to peering it back to these chapters, it actually makes it relatively simple in that it would be the overarching principle, at least from my perspective, would be an activity that would otherwise occur in rural zoned area that doesn't have the overlay across it, that the applicant is seeking to undertake within that area. That's where at that point, that's where we'd need to have consideration at what level we would subsidise and how, which parts of the process would be subsidised. But I think that's in my mind anyway, that's the most simplest way of approaching it. But anyway, sorry, Mr. Chair.
No, that's right. And in actual fact, the 41-page document that accompanied Minister Bishop's announcements about stage 2 and 3 of the plan does actually talk about the possibility down the track of there having to be some financial compensation or recognition to landowners who may be affected by the so-called need for the greater good of the country. Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I was thinking exactly the same thing that you were when you said we could be here all day if we discussed the particularity of these matters. And I was trying to actually formulate in my own mind a means of addressing number one and possibly any others that we may have concerns about. And I will move as follows. That the District Plan Review Subcommittee reconfirms its 12 December 2024 resolution seeking a reviewed definition of agricultural intensification with possible removal of references to irrigation as part of that review.
So just read that again for us because, and then I'll seek a seconder for you.
Well, I think it was seconded by Councillor McCone. Was it or was it not? Yes, that the DPR subcommittee reconfirms its 12 December 2024 resolution seeking a review of the definition of agricultural intensification. I will add the words in the PDP with possible removal of references to irrigation as part of that review.
You happy to second that? Do we have anyone that wants to speak to that motion?
Well, just very briefly, if I may, it'll go to council. The full council can, as it turns out, I'm not going to be at the council meeting on the 29th, unfortunately. I have an appointment in Dunedin, surprise, surprise, only able to be executed on that day. But the council can decide whether it wishes to uphold that, and officers can come back present that either directly to council or to the DPR subcommittee, should they choose. But my view is, I don't believe we can continue to insist that the world is, that the year is 2022 or 2023. There have been substantial political changes in the interim. There are inescapably clear signals as to where Parliament wants the planning framework to go. There's reference that the two major parties in Parliament are potentially in accord in this matter. And I just reiterate, if the purpose of the reforms is to narrow the scope of the resource management system and the effects it controls with the enjoyment of property rights the guiding principle, then it is fundamentally, there is a fundamental issue as to whether an agricultural intensification will even be a matter that the new legislation will allow consideration of. So I just think, I think for a variety of reasons, the suggestion I've made moves us on.
All right, before I put the motion, I'm going to, and before I take Mr. Campbell, I just want to point out that what we're actually doing is a rather protracted way of saying we reject the recommendation of officers on this particular chapter. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do have to be careful in terms of what we are required to legislate at the moment under the RMA. We know what's coming. As I've said, the three matters listed in the definition are signalled to be included in future legislation. So the SASM, landscapes, biodiversity, how they deal with a range of things that may rub up against them is yet to be known. But some of the activities I already mentioned that will be affected by the rules, such as commercial forestry, is subject to a existing national environmental standard that may be changed as well and trump any rule. Quarrying or mining may be subject to national direction as well. There's no signal around sort of a farming national direction, but we already know that some of these things already listed in the plan may be dealt with at a later date in future legislation. And if that's the case, they will simply come out of the plan or be superseded. So I don't think we need to get too hung up on what is or isn't in the plan now, knowing what is coming. All we're saying is we're signalling where there's those key values, the three things that we've talked about, then there's a trigger for a consent. If that disappears down the track, that's what we have to adjust, and we will. We've already acknowledged that in the past. In terms of the recommendation, I think all we could suggest, which I mentioned before, is maybe deleting that last line of the definition. I think if it came back to council, that's probably what we'd also recommend down the track in a few weeks' time. So yeah, that's where we would likely end up. But just for that wider context, I certainly acknowledge Councillor Hopkins' point about where the future's heading. Lots of things in the plan will be affected by that and maybe superseded and elevated even higher in importance. But yeah, that's where we're at the moment.
All right. No further speakers to the motion. I will put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Councillor Blackler is noted as being against. I declare the motion carried. All right, we move on to historic heritage. Does anyone have any comments on this particular? Councillor Hopkins? I will point out I didn't come to you as a heritage member first. You were the first to have your hand up.
Look, I've raised this matter before because I'm perhaps, I don't know, David, you may have in other jurisdictions had experience of this, but I have been on the council where guidelines and standards have applied. And the problem with guidelines is that they're not enforceable. And the difficulty I have with what we are proposing here, is the means by which, for instance, if you look at the 4 bullet points on page 11, HH, OHA, OHA, P4 and P6 require that development and signage is consistent with the guidelines. And then HH, OHA, R7 identifies consistency as a matter of discretion. The difficulty is we still haven't defined the means by which that test will be assessed and who will do it. And I believe we need to. For example, in Akaroa, they had a defined heritage area, and applications to build in that area were submitted to a panel of lay people and 2 heritage architects. And they signed off on, yes, this will work, we like it, it fits in with everything else, or no, it doesn't. Now, I'm not suggesting that we necessarily do that, but what I'm saying is I still believe we have failed to actually grasp the nettle of specifying, for the benefit of people seeking to develop in the areas, the Oamaru historic area, we're not telling them, we're telling them that things have to be consistent and that consistency is important, but we're not actually spelling out how we're going to, what hurdles they actually have to jump and what tests they actually have to meet. And if there are no tests, then the guidelines, in my view, are unenforceable. Now, we may be happy with that, but unless we're prepared to sort of either convert those guidelines into standards and define a process by which the standard needs to be met, or accept that if they are just guidelines, people may be able to thumb their noses at us and say, don't care, I'm going to do it anyway. Now, it might well be that we can hold them up, we can say it's not consistent. There may well be subsequent legal challenges to the Environment Court and so on. But I just think there needs to be a little bit more work on how this particular policy solution is going to be managed and implemented.
So the nub of this particular issue, as I see it, is currently we have guidelines. Staff are in favour of having the guidelines remain. The original position of the subcommittee was to shift guidelines to standards. Mr. Cook.
Thank you. I'm just curious as to whether the elected members would consider that if they became standards, that was imposing on individual property rights.
Look, it probably is, but then again, if you're going to be purist about that, you might say get rid of standards and guidelines. Take a Dallas approach, if you wish, where there's very little in the way of regulation with regard to any building at all. If you have an area whose character you wish to preserve, it's reasonable to actually have a set of general principles and public intentions as to how you achieve those outcomes. And that's I don't have any particular difficulty with that. What I'm trying to say here is a standard is something that you can say, right, this is what we have said we want, and here are the means by which we will assess your proposal in regard to what we've said we want. A guideline is, hey, look, if you're of a mind to do this, then by all means go ahead. The question I have consistently raised is, what do you do if the person says no?
Mr Campbell?
Thank you, councillors. I think we get a bit hung up on maybe the terminology, but the heritage rules, particularly for the Oamaru Historic Area, do set out, permitted, controlled, discretionary, etc., and have standards listed. So, for instance, where it's exterior heritage maintenance works, the rule talks specifically about colour, texture, form, and design. So they have to be the same or similar to the original material. So there's already a trigger there to capture that type of thing. What the guideline does is say, here's some examples of how that's been done well, and here's some examples of where it hasn't. From locally. So it's really saying to people, here's how you can make it look and feel to be in keeping with the area and help you comply with the rules effectively. There's quite specific rules around signage, for instance, around size, shape, illumination, etc. So we do have quite a prescriptive set of standards for these areas. The guidelines are really there to help people try and navigate their way through that and see the good and not so good examples of where that's been done. And as assisted by a heritage advisor as well, and Heritage NZ are usually pretty good at helping people with that as advocates for heritage.
Suppose, may I ask one quick? So you're satisfied that the specified standards, or the permitted, controlled, discretionary, etc. standards are enough of an assessment tool and essentially create a framework for, so do you feel there's any need for assessment by parties other than planners? I mean, have we built in, I'm sorry, I should remember this, but I just don't at the moment. Have we built in assessment, for the sake of argument, similar to the Akaroa one, with a heritage architect or something like that being involved?
Yeah, again, it depends on the scale of what's being done. So often we might say if it's a very minor matter, it might even be a marginal activity approval that's, and heritage advisor would say, yeah, that's appropriate. It doesn't really impact on the building, and it proceeds down a lot smoother path. If there's more substantive alterations or additions, for example, the gallery extension, we certainly go to Heritage New Zealand as more an expert in that, and there might be a heritage conservation architect involved. But again, it's to match the scales. We're not putting people through a huge cost or time while they get that advice. But obviously, if it's a large change or a substantial building, they'll do that. But in this case, the guidelines are probably more aimed at sort of average mum and dad building owners that just need a bit of help to navigate the rules and get some ideas. But yeah, to answer the question, Councillor Hopkins, the rules I think provide the adequate level of protection, and the Section 32 supports that.
Are you going to move?
Yes.
All right.
I was going to move that the DPR subcommittee recommends to council, endorses the officer submission regarding town centre design guidelines.
Well, thank you.
And recommends council adopts that approach.
I'm happy to second that. Is there anyone else want to speak to it? All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Against? Carried. We're doing really well. It's taken us 50 minutes to get through the first two.
Mr. Chair, could I just ask a question? Do we really need to do a specific motion for each item, or could we just amend the recommendation to have a point 2 that are around agreed amendments or something like that?
Mr. Campbell?
I think for these first few, and we're on the last one now that have come from the subcommittee, it's probably worth doing them one by one. But when you get down to the other ones, you may wish to group them or deal with them that way. Thank you.
Because that's correct. These first three were where we asked for staff. So, again, I imagine there'll be some discussion around the ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity. The request was that we used a percentage-based threshold as against a fixed square meterage Councillor Blackler first, and then I'll come to you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you. I just had a question, and I take the team's point about kind of trying to quantify the potential impact of such a move there. I was just wondering what would be the possibility of having, say, like a threshold of kind of attached to lot size. So say anything sub 20 hectares to 200 and 200 and above, and having a different threshold for each.
Yeah, I think it's the same issue that we've kind of come to is you have to do quite a bit of analysis to work out where the SNAs or threatened areas are, and B, then work out, could a tiered approach like that be applied? We know, there's vast parts of the district that don't have many values at all left, and obviously the rule won't be triggered, but it's probably in those other areas where there's potential for more intensive development, then that could make it tricky, because people could try and subdivide or work around it by changing that land tenure to get around the rule. All we're saying is the approach is consistent with what other districts do. It's basically saying when you destroy or apply consent to destroy a certain area, it's the size of the destruction that counts, regardless of whether it's on 1,000 hectares or 10. So we've got some quite small land holdings with quite big areas of native vegetation. So yeah, losing any of that's probably not a good thing.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, Mr. Campbell, but let's say we apply the new framework for subdivision to rural zoning, and let's say there's a 200 hectare lot with evenly distributed biodiversity values across it. That farm at present would be able to remove X amount of undertake X amount of indigenous vegetation clearance, but if under the district plan it followed the permitted activity for subdivision and subdivided into 10 20 hectare lots, 10 times the amount of vegetation clearance could occur. And so to me that just seems illogical.
Yeah, there's always going to be those scenarios where people game the system to try and do that, but the rules are set out to try and deal with different types of vegetation, different environments, regardless of land tenure. So it's difficult how you try and slice and dice it, I guess, in that respect. But I think if submissions come in that suggest a vastly different approach, then it's probably time to look at it potentially.
I think this is symptomatic of a whole raft of issues through our plan, where we tend to submit an academic solution to a practical problem. And the fact is, I farm 181 hectares. I've got neighbours that farm 300. I've got neighbours who farm several thousand, and yet we all have the same allocation. And to me, it's quite perverse and prescriptive. Whereas, but at this stage, within the planning framework, I don't see the imagination to try and incorporate that within our district, and particularly here, and the vast difference in terms of farm types and regimes across the whole district. Councillor McCone?
I just endorse what you're saying, and just an example comes to mind. A lot of those bigger holdings out there that are affected by this, especially in the Awatere ward and up through that part in the back of Waihemo, they've got several titles or several things. There's farm succession. So what happens when that property would like to put a house on the separate title that doesn't have any building, and yet it has biodiversity problems and everything else. Are those guys going to be penalised for trying to retire or put farm succession on their own properties? You know, on that basis, you know, and I read the response here, I don't really totally agree at all with the biodiversity officer advice of, you know, extensive ecological surveys. It's pretty simple stuff, really. I think we're getting a bit fussy.
Mr Campbell?
I guess, yeah, the difficulty is our starting point is we do have those blanket area thresholds at the moment in the current plan, and they've tended to work in the sense of the area threshold. The rules themselves have been a bit difficult to interpret sometimes. So it really is a carryover of that regime and very similar to what other councils use. So we haven't come across a system that's being talked about. Yeah, and I get the point Councillor McCone raised is, you know, consensus we're dealing with at the moment around the, you know, putting houses in these sensitive locations and how people, you know, I guess mitigate that by maybe choosing a careful location or planting elsewhere. So it's not a no, it's just a process to go through and make sure people consider those values or, you know, meet the threshold and don't trigger consent. But yeah, there's got to be some trigger there, I guess, is the starting point, which we do have now in the current plan.
Yeah, and I suppose, David, I find it, and there's no disrespect, that very contradictory is you can come and buy a quarter acre section on road that might have an old garden, you can flatten that and build a house on it, but on your own property, which is respected as a garden, it's just a bit bigger than the normal ones, so you can't do that.
Mr Campbell, yeah, I accept your reservations about what we had requested. I don't necessarily agree with them, but I can understand from a planning perspective the concerns that you have. But is there another way that the planning team might recommend to us that could at least go some way towards addressing the, you know, the concerns that I think are largely shared around the table?
Yeah, I think as we've pointed out there, it would take a lot more advice and information to, you know, test it against what other options that other councils have used, whether it's regional councils or elsewhere. We'd have to go through and do the work to see where that percentage threshold may or may not be able to be applied, as we've said there. So, yeah, if you wanted us to commission that work, we'd have to outsource it. So there'd be another cost to do that in the meantime.
Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, Mr Chair, I suppose the difficulty here is a very obvious one, namely that the rule we have at the present penalises larger properties because it sets a specified meterage threshold in terms of vegetation clearance, and it appears to simply categorise Indigenous vegetation as that, rather than subclassifications such as might warrant the extensive ecological surveys referred to by the biodiversity officer. But the difficulty, I suppose, by switching from a specified meterage solution to a percentage of total land ownership as a clearance rule is that with bigger properties that would involve a substantially greater amount of Indigenous vegetation clearance. I suppose one solution, were we to switch from a meterage solution to a meter-based solution to a percentage-based solution, would be to have a very conservative percentage established. The other option may be that in this instance, it may be that submissions from the interested parties and proposals from them might actually be the most helpful in terms of people having a clear understanding of the issues on the ground and also proposing very specific and effective solutions. I mean, if we are going to switch from the meter rules we have at the moment to a percentage, we're going to need to do some work or require somebody to do some work, because I'm not sure you can just pluck a percentage requirement out of thin air. But to the extent that we do it quickly, then I imagine we would favour a conservative percentage rather than a fairly liberal one, being what we would apply. Yeah, I'm really in two minds about this.
Well, the thing is, we've currently got the recommendation of officers that it's not progressed, or the alternative, that it's considered as a variation to the plan to allow the time and resources required for the evidence. So
yeah, maybe, yeah, actually, that's probably the solution. In fact, you're quite right. It's a bit kicking, it's arguably slightly in the kicking the can down the road direction, but yeah, I will move that the DPR subcommittee recommends that this matter be considered as a variation to the plan to allow the time and resources required to collect evidence regarding the thresholds.
all right. We have that motion. I'll just, do we have a seconder for that motion? All right, that lapses.
Yeah, I see.
Well, please be more prompt in future, councillor. All right, Mr. Campbell, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question around, would the variation be considered upon receipt of submissions that were seeking that, or just a variation outright? I'm just querying whether there'd be a trigger to do a variation if no one raises it as an issue versus doing a variation when for the sake of it.
I would be comfortable in terms of others raising the issue, because I'm sure that there are lots of people who see the current inequity. So, but that's just my personal opinion. Is there anyone else want to? Councillor Blackler?
Oh, just as a question around process, Mr. Campbell, can the district plan subcommittee make essentially request that officers make a submission on behalf of the on behalf of the subcommittee, like at our direction into the on behalf of council? Can we do that? Or if from a professional perspective you don't necessarily agree, but we felt that we would like something to be submitted on.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Blackler. Essentially, this is the process today. I guess we've given the professional expert advice on certain matters. Like so this one where we're saying we're not sure that as Councillor Hopkins mentioned, a sort of number or percentage could be come up with today. We've said further work would need to be done. And a variation is only to explore a variation. It doesn't mean it's going to give you the magic answer. It's just saying here's the work to promulgate a variation, and it might suggest something else or status quo. You're still got to go through that exercise of doing the variation and the Section 32 analysis, but it would at least give you the options to consider. At this stage, the option is stick with the status quo.
Yeah, I just note that the National Environmental Standard on Plantation Forestry actually sets a value online at 0.015 times the area. So there are other applications, I guess, of that type of methodology for clearance of Indigenous biodiversity.
Yeah, I understand what you're trying to say, David, but on the other side, there's still no financial benefits to those that are applying. You can get a job done for $2,000, but it costs you $10,000 in fees and consents and everything before you start. It costs a lot of money to get that machinery out there, and you don't get it out there for little. And when you get it out there, you want to get the job done properly. So I think there's certainly got to be some consideration taken into the amount and the amount it is costing to get the job done.
Mr. Chair, I'll move the motion be put.
Thank you for telling me how to do my job, councillor. Yeah. No, we do have a motion on the table, and even though the secretary was a bit tardy, or the seconder was a bit tardy. So all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. All right. Sorry, and councillor Blacklow would like his abstention noted. We move on to the number of officer recommendations, and I'm happy, if you're happy, Mr. Campbell, that we work through these and then pass them in their entirety or reject them in their entirety. Do you want to speak to this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, these are largely around trying to improve or clarify matters. So the first one has come from our infrastructure team, and really just is clearing up the fact that the threshold for triggering a requirement for road is set at more than 10 residential units. It currently appears to be 6. So it's just a positive thing there in terms of future development, and largely aligns with other council's approach. Happy to answer any questions on that.
Councillor Hopkins.
Well, I suppose I just have one. It makes perfect sense to have a standard, and I note that there is one in the operative district plan. But given the issues with roading that we have, and given the costs of actually accepting additional elements or components of the roading network, do we want to actually impose upon ourselves a requirement to vest? Or are we inclined to be a little bit more pragmatic and leave the matter with the developer and the purchasers of the properties on the newly created roads that may come under consideration?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hopkins. That's a very good question. There's 2 elements to it. One is, I guess, the traffic effects and the minimum standards for the number of units using that piece of infrastructure. So once you get above 10, you're talking quite a few vehicle movements. There might be a need for a footpath, that type of thing. So there's that safety and usability of the infrastructure. There's never going to be the right number exactly when you pick it. But the other aspect we can look at, and sometimes do, is we have a development right on the cusp. You look at it and say, what's the future development potential of those lots being served? If it's right at its limit, you might say, well, if it's 11 units, there can't be any more, then we might be happy to leave it as a private way, because it can't be further subdivided and increased. But where you've got large lots and it might be, at that limit, you might say, well, we do want it as road, because then future people can develop and it's not restricting them in that sense.
So the requirement based is conditional, it's not automatic.
Yes, that's right. There is still that discretion to weigh that, but
Yep.
and it sets a clear expectation for developers what they need to provide up front, so they're clear.
Yep. No, no further questions on that one. We'll move on to stormwater.
Thank you. So again, from the infrastructure team, this one's just been picked out in terms of the return period design requirements, which is quite onerous to do a 100-year RI system. So again, it's just amending that to change it to be more usable, I guess, and achievable, essentially.
The next one in terms of resource consent within the flood hazard overlays.
Yep, thanks. So again, this one's a wee bit odd because the ECAN approach to flood hazards is a bit more sort of generic, and often a lot of our areas are within those and can do a suitable stormwater system, noting that there might be overland flow like we've seen in Odamatata, those areas, but in those sort of flood events, it's probably not as critical to have a 1 in 100-year system, and what they're proposing will still work. We accept it's going to be flooding. It's just more an engineering matter, that one.
No questions on that? Or Councillor Bristol?
Yeah, David, just on French's Road, I believe that was triggered, the changes were triggered.
You're way ahead,
Oh,
guys.
sorry, beg your pardon.
You're way ahead.
Oh, okay, reserve that for later.
All right. So we move into natural hazards.
Right. So yeah, this is just a timing thing in terms of when the previous work has been done in terms of the geotech matters and the approved resource consent. So it's kind of a mechanical thing to make sure people aren't tripped up twice. If they've done the work, that's acknowledged and move on. It's pretty straightforward in that NH8. Any questions?
Move on to updated flood mapping from the ORC.
Yep.
And I'll go to Councillor Percival because we've made it to French's Road.
Yeah, David, just in regard to that, I believe, I was quite 100% sure that was triggered by a property sale. Has the area increased or reduced?
Thank you, Councillor Percival. Yeah, it was at the request of a property owner. I think it was going through a sale. So both the previous owner and the new owner are aware of this information. They've seen the maps from ORC. They just hadn't been given to us in time to be included in the plan. By and large, it has decreased to the terrace edge. There's a tiny little bit upstream that's increased, but it's not substantial. They're happy with the maps as ORC's provided to them. They just hadn't got to us in time.
Just supplement to that, it hasn't intruded on existing properties around that property, which had the question for that. It hasn't affected further down or further up?
No, that's a fair question. Generally, there's a reduction overall upstream and downstream of that property. There's a slight little piece that bulges into one area that's a low-lying piece anyway, so it's very minimal and reflects the lie of the land effectively. By and large, it's a net reduction.
The next one, sorry, Councillor Hopkins.
Look, this is where I come back to the question I did ask at the start. Because what the officers are saying here, I'm not challenging the mapping because we can't, in the sense ORC have an absolute right to do that in statute. But we're saying an update on the flood map hazard mapping for French's Road was received from ORC after the PDP was notified. This needs to be added to the planning maps, flood hazard overlay. So I presume that that's something that's actually going to change in the document. that the mapping will change and that people after the 29th of April, assuming this recommendation from us is to adopt and council approves, I presume the mapping will change. Is that correct?
So this will be a submission to the plan to say, change the maps based on ORC as the expert advisor. The landowner has been made aware of this, so they can submit as well if they choose to. And it's for a hearings panel to make that change if they deem it necessary. They'll obviously question ORC that, you know, is this the right thing? And if they agree, I imagine they'll change it fairly easily. It's not something we can change in the interim.
No, councillor, the explanation is this will go through exactly the same process. It will have to go through because the current plan has been proposed, this will not arbitrarily be added to it. Is that correct, Mr. Campbell?
It just seems a body with statutory powers to impose maps and define flood hazard areas has said we are changing our mapping and we want to amend it in relation to French's Road. If the document remains unaltered, then effectively it's misleading. And what I don't understand why this one can sit outside the current proposed district plan and apparently can be challenged by us. Whereas all the other floodplain mapping, including North Oamaru and so on, appears to be inviolate and set in stone. It seems to me that we're actually sanctioning a process that misleads the public.
Well, my understanding would be that after the plan has been notified, we've received different information. Therefore, that information is open to scrutiny, but Mr. Campbell will.
Yeah, it is an unfortunate timing issue, and the good thing is the landowners are aware of it. They've been notified by ORC. Here's what we've reassessed. We'll be providing it to council. It didn't get to us in time. We've said we will happily support it as a staff submission. So by council saying we want to include it, gives it more, I guess, weight. ORC can also submit the same, and we encourage them to do so, so that it's got that weight behind it, so that when it is considered, it can be approved without any further issue. Likewise, other landowners might say, hey, I'm not sure about the flood hazard on my property. Can that be re-looked at as part of the submission process? This is just one of probably many that might do that. This one's been done as part of the draft plan feedback. It is unfortunate that the timing didn't pick it up, but we're addressing it now.
But the thing, Councillor Hopkins, we're dealing with a living document somewhere on the line. This is going to occur. Are you happy? I just wasn't sure. Yes.
A very, very simple question with regard to the next one, and David should be able to clarify it immediately. What we have in front of us is an amendment that looks as though the comma after the word district is deleted because it's got a line through it. But the description is to add the comma, which I don't think makes sense anyway. But are you proposing to delete that comma or add it?
Thank you, Councillor. We are proposing to add it so that it's separates out that part of the sentence. Because there's the Canterbury, the Canterbury region of the district, comma, it is not located in a high flood hazard area. Based on
in that case, I would suggest that for that to be to achieve the clarity you want, you should have a comma after the word and as well. So it would read and comma if the activity is located within the Canterbury region of the district, comma, it is not located, etc.
Yep, we can look at that.
All right. We've navigated the natural hazards. We go to historic heritage, and the first one is define the extent of quarry site heritage items. Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, I had a question about this one, Mr. Chair. And my view is, it's premature to actually approve this. I noticed that these items are currently being assessed by a heritage consultant. They're going to be reported to council before consideration. So if they're available on the 29th of April, so be it. But were I to be in attendance on that day, I would be asking the very fundamental question: what are the attitudes of the owners of the properties concerned? And that would have a significant bearing on how I responded to the proposal. But we don't even know what we're being asked to say yes to at this stage, other than a very, very broad generality with regard to those 6 sites, but the particularities within them, Wharakuri village ruins, for instance, Hedges Fellmongery, what exactly are we proposing to identify as heritage items? So I think it is premature to endorse this officer recommendation.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. It's a good point that the item's really there more for information to say it's coming. The difficulty, I guess, is if you just have a point on a map to say this is the item, it leaves it open to interpretation, or how far is the extent of that item if it's not defined spatially. So we're trying to actually make it clearer for the owner that it's only these parts of the quarry item that are of heritage value. So it's not wider than what it could be interpreted as. So hopefully that will assist them, everyone down the line. So they're already listed, it's just being a bit clearer what the actual heritage matters are that we're seeking to include or exclude as well.
So you're saying that you're actually wanting to be more prescriptive so the landowner understands?
Well, on that basis, I'm slightly, my concerns are assuaged, but I still think that David's point is that it's here for information. And I think unless and until council or another body, possibly the District Plan Review Subcommittee, but preferably I imagine from the point of view of time, council, unless and until council sees the assessment currently being undertaken by the heritage consultant, I don't see how we can say yay or nay.
Yeah, that's correct. It's really just to give a precursor to what's coming once that work's been done.
No further discussion on that point. We are calendared to stop for morning tea at 10:30. I would suggest to members of the committee you go and load up on caffeine, because we have a large number of pages to get through in the allotted time, and we need to be as efficient as possible. So I'm going to adjourn the meeting at this stage, and we'll start again promptly at 10:45.
Ready to go?
All right, welcome back. We're suitably refreshed and recharged. Resuming on at the top of page 16. We have 4 members of the committee, that's quorum.
Mr. Chair, I had a question mark with regard to the proposal to change the word exceptional to outstanding. As a matter of general principle, I would argue that any change of wording in a planning document exposes you to perverse and unanticipated outcomes by way of Environment Court rulings and so on. The other thing is that I would be the only councillor here, or the only person in the room, I think, who was actually on council at the time that this issue was first raised. And the issue is the same issue that's cropping up with a few other officer recommendations on this 22-page list today. And the issue was that officers or parties, third parties, were classifying buildings as being category A or incorporating them in the heritage listings when the owners were objecting to that classification. And the outcome, the resolution that went to council specifically used the word exceptional in relation to an assessment that countermanded a property owner's unhappiness with the classification. In other words, if a heritage advisor said this is an exceptional building, which is the highest test possible, then yes, they could override the individual property owner and propose the incorporation or the inclusion of the property in our heritage listings. I would be opposed to actually diluting or potentially diluting that test. And so I would advocate that we don't accept this officer recommendation, but that we do, in that particular context, retain the word exceptional.
The way I read the officer recommendations, it's a standardisation of language, not only across our own plan, but across other plans. Have I read that right, Mr. Campbell?
Yes, that's correct. It's just trying to be consistent across the board. I'm not sure that it dilutes things too much in terms of the wording, but it could be corrected on that.
Mr. Chair, the only time the word exceptional crops up is in the context of a council resolution enabling heritage advisors to override a property owner's objection to classification. And the basis on which we, the council, have said the heritage advisor is entitled to override the property owner is if they can demonstrate that the property in question is exceptional. And I do not believe we should dilute that test or potentially dilute it. And it's all very well saying exceptional is the same, means the same as outstanding and vice versa. That is ultimately for parties other than ourselves to determine, either the district courts or the Environment Court. And heaven alone knows what they would conclude.
Councillor McCone.
Yeah, I would completely disagree, Jim. The word outstanding means it is outstanding to the area at the time. Exceptional means if when you're starting to take on a battle from the ownership side of things, the word exceptional can actually create more trouble than it's worth. Exceptional, the interpretation is it's a word, but it says it's something special. Whereas outstanding does say it's special, but it fits into a whole raft of things. And I don't think by using those words, you're actually taking the ownership of the actual property away from the person that owns it, and you're categorising in a word rather than a substance. Secondly, David, just a question for you. Does this all coincide with what the Heritage, what do you call it, the Historic Places Trust or whatever they're called now? Does that all fit inside their boxes with what they do?
Thank you, councillors. Just to reiterate, this is the category A items, which is different to the category B items where we sought that landowner agreement. So there's a wee difference there. I might just hand over to Mike to answer Councillor McCone's question on the Heritage NZ. He's had some experience in that area.
Oh, thank you, councillors. I think one of the things that historically there's been difficulty with is trying to defend different degrees of significance using different terminology. And that's why the outstanding has sort of become a standard use in RPSs. I think Heritage New Zealand Pāhuri Taonga Act uses it. I'd have to check that, but I'm pretty sure it uses it. But in the early days, there was legal arguments as to what was, let's say, exceptional versus outstanding and other things like that. And it went to and fro and until there was standardization in which people could decide, yes, that's what is, we believe passes that threshold. So it kind of went through a lot of legal uncertainty before it arrived at some terminology that, in terms of outstanding, that was seen as being more robust. So that's kind of where it came from. And that's, in terms of the justification, I think in terms of using that, I'm obviously unaware of the background in terms of the exceptional that's been used here at Waitaki, but yeah.
Look, Councillor Hopkins, you've made your point, and unless it's further clarification of that, I'm going to move on
Well, it is
because
further clarification very quickly. If I understand, thank you, Mike, for the explanation. I don't agree with John, but clearly if the word outstanding has become the standard or the means by which assessment is defined, so be it. But there are two issues here. If in the third column, we talk about amending the term used in the plan, that's fine. But there is also a council resolution on the books that will continue to include the word exceptional. And that, in my view, will need to be amended as well.
Mr. Campbell.
The resolution stands as it's worded. I mean, this is to do with the wording in the plan, the category A items specifically. So it doesn't change the resolution as such, but the meaning in the plan's clear what it's trying to do.
So we have a resolution in the plan, so different things.
Is there, sorry?
I mean, the resolution relates to the wording at the time, so that's still relevant. What we're saying now is the wording going back to outstanding is more consistent and doesn't take away from what the resolution did at the time of the resolution.
Yeah, look, I'm not trying to diminish the point that you're making, councillor, but there doesn't appear to be a great deal of support around the table for the use of exceptional, although I know that we all are exceptional. Moving on to the next one, it's Councillor McGowan.
Look, it's generic across the whole thing, but upgrading these from B to A and everything else, is that on recommendation from whom? So does the historic places, or whatever you like to call them, say this needs to be upgraded to that, or is this coming from the district plan? So are we working parallel with these guys, or as opposed to with these guys to identify this stuff?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Councillor McCone. There is that overlap with Heritage NZ in terms of the classifications. Doesn't mean to say that an A and a B might also be classified by them, but they might have a different ranking as well. So they do tend to align.
Yeah.
Councillor Hopkins.
Mr. Chair, we've jumped one, but looks as though there's no comment being sought to be made by members on the heritage restoration to the exterior character contributing buildings. I also questioned the reinsertion of HH 111 Doctor's House Kurau as a category item. Basically, it is clear from what the officers are saying, the landowners do not want it. So they've said no, and we're saying that a peer review has found, hey presto, that it should be reinstated. Now, in my view, this is exactly what that resolution of the council to which I was, resolution of the council to which I was referring earlier, addressed. And again, I come back to narrow the scope of the resource management system and the effects it controls with the enjoyment of property rights, the guiding principle. Now, the enjoyment of property rights as a guiding principle includes, I would have thought, the right to say, no, I don't want it listed against my will as a heritage building. So in my view, we should not accept this particular officer's submission.
If you're being consistent in that, you'll find that the same thing applies to Heritage Site 223 Shag Point on the next page.
And that was exactly the point I was going to make about that as well. And I did have a question about the one after that, the HH 87 Borough Water Rates. But I was simply going through them one at a time. But what I've just said about the doctor's cottage, doctor's house, would definitely apply to Shag Point Miners Cobb Cottage as well.
Again, I'd just like to make a general statement. So in a previous life, I worked with some of these historic A and B through the historic plans and bits and pieces. It was cheaper for me then to actually walk away and build modern buildings outside the perimeter rather than actually do it for the stuff we went up. My point being, you'd be very careful how specific you are and start delegating, as Jim just said, on the people's personal property rights. So I think that needs to be revisited somehow. I'm not sure how, but.
Just for clarification, Mr. Campbell, these particular properties were classified in category B, and the peer review or whatever is trying to have them reinserted as category A. Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially, the two out of the list that were asked to be withdrawn, I think it was a dozen or so in that list of the category B, are of higher value. It's why that's suggested they go to category A. It doesn't mean they'll potentially stay that way. This is just saying, can we lodge a submission to at least raise this issue? And, you know, hearings panel will make that call. The landowner can submit, Heritage NZ can submit, others, etc. It's just to say it's potentially at a higher category than originally thought.
My question then is, if there are other agencies that wanted to pursue this, is there a necessity for us to be standing against the wishes of our individual ratepayer who's going, I don't want it listed, and allow those outside agencies to submit?
Yeah, it certainly doesn't take away from anyone submitting on any of these items. So it's just flagging that the expert advice is that it should be an A. We could sort of remain neutral on that and not do anything, or we could be proactive and say, hey, let's get it into the mix for consideration. Yeah.
Councillor Backler?
I personally support what's been put forward here. I think, you know, by way of resolution last year, we gave the signal to go out to the community for those that were on the B list, and we heard back from them and we removed what Mr. Campbell, 98% of the buildings from the category B buildings have now been removed, and there's just what we're seeing here is just a couple that actually on peer review have actually kind of deemed being worthy of being elevated to category A. So I don't have a problem with this.
Councillor McCone?
I think the concern for me is it's a peer review. It's actually not the landowner's review in the first place. And if they own it and they've got outside influences and everything else, it should be up to them whether they decide which category they want to be in when they are approached, not to be told by us.
Councillor Hopkins?
Mr. Chair, we have been told that outside agencies, including HNZ, are able to submit. Mr. Campbell has, I think, tactfully indicated that we can, if we are so minded, remain neutral. I'm trying to just think of I'd possibly even be guided by David, but option one would be to actually, in the case of HH111 and HH223, to recommend to council that the landowner's request be upheld, or conversely, that our recommendation to council is that both properties remain category B heritage items. And perhaps in the interest of achieving neutrality, and perhaps to some extent placating Councillor Blackler, I'll move that the DPR subcommittee recommends that HHH 111 item remain a category B heritage item, and HH 223 heritage item remain a category B heritage item.
I'll just get clarification from Mr. Campbell before I look for a second.
I think for the purpose of this process, all the subcommittee needs to do is say, we agree to submit on this point, or we don't agree to submit on this matter.
Oh, okay.
So I think just to keep it clear, and that way you've had the advice. If this ever reappears down the line in way of a report to a hearings panel and so on, we've got the information that yes, there is a peer review. We can draw that out if needed, if it is submitted on.
Well, since you haven't called for a second, Mr. Chair, thankfully, I will move that the DPR subcommittee recommends that council do not submit on the matters regarding HH111 and HH223.
Do we have a seconder for that? Councillor McCone. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Mr. Cook.
Can I ask a question just in connection with that? Are there any new items, category A, that have been added in the proposed district plan? i.e., subject matter experts have recommended items as A, which are sitting as A's now. So we've made the decision, the council has made a decision that those items A, based on expert opinion, are outstanding. We've got additional expert opinion that these are outstanding. Does that have implications for other category A?
Well, all of the category A's and B's have had advice as to what category they should be. This is two that, as Councillor Blackler said, have sort of been re-looked at and could be elevated. So they're still all up for grabs in that sense through the submission process.
We move on then to the additional mapping on.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair, can I just ask a question in regard to the borough water race? It does seem to me, Dave, Mr. Campbell, based on the information in front of us, that once again, this is actually at this point for our information only, because the last second bullet point on the right-hand side says an external archaeologist will be engaged to provide further advice on this, and this will be reported to council for consideration before it is included. So it's premature to come to a view on this one, is it not?
Yes, that's correct. It's like an earlier matter where we'd signalled what's being re-looked at, and this is the same for the next few, right down to HH166. It's basically signalling that there's a review of the setting to hopefully refine it and improve clarity. So you can effectively park those if you wish. It's just more informative thing to say they are coming for these handful of heritage items and settings.
Thank you for that, Mr. Campbell. And Councillor Hopkins, that was the point that I was about to make when I was going to go HH87 and you cut me off at the pass. So we can actually look at those 1, 2, 3, 4 matters and probably move on to notable trees.
So this one is basically a replacement in line with the Memorial Oaks approach. So we're just being consistent with what they wish to be included and doesn't create any great imposition on anyone. For tree 040.
All right, we then move on to natural features and landscape, where we have a change of terminology in matters of discretion from dry grassland character to vegetation character. Mr. Campbell, would you like to give an explanation before that? Then I'll go to Councillor Percival.
Thank you. Yeah, this is just basically reflecting that not all areas will be dry grassland. So it's making sure we're not limited in the scope of what we're expected to consider. So it's just a correction really to allow proper consideration.
Councillor Percival?
I didn't really follow your explanation, but for me, just looking at it, dry grassland changing to vegetation, that's like 100% difference. Dry grassland is dry grassland. A vegetation character can include anything from a piece of cocksfoot to a mature beech tree. So you're either classifying something as in its character as dry grassland, or you're not. I'm not quite grasping.
Okay, yeah, no, it does need a bit of explanation. Thank you, Councillor Percival. Effectively, what we're saying is when there's a consent or activity that's going to be triggered in those areas, the natural landscapes, features, etc., and we're assessing the effect of that activity on the vegetative character, not all of those areas are going to be dry grassland. So you might have an area, like you said, a beech forest or Madigari or some other sort of indigenous vegetation. It's not the exotics, to say, you know, what's the effect on that existing vegetation character. We're not seeking to make it all dry grassland. It's just being more clear that it's reflecting on what is on each site, which will be different in different locations. So it picks up your point.
Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, look, David, I accept point Mr. Campbell, I accept the point you're making. What I personally would prefer, in order to ensure clarity and no possible exposure to, again, somebody else deciding that dry grassland character and vegetation character mean different things, is that if you look at the bullet point on page 19, officers recommend that this terminology is amended to vegetation character to address those areas of ONL, ONF, SNF and RSL that are not within a dry grassland area. And I would just prefer to have the definition or the reference make the point that we wish to preserve dry grassland character or vegetation character in those areas of ONL, etc., that are not within the dry grassland. I just think that would be the best way to do it.
Yeah, we can do that. It's a wee bit more clunky, but it doesn't change the thing. Yeah.
Councillor Hopkins' point is correct, because we're talking about various ecosystems. So we actually do need to be specific. If they are currently going to be subject to these proposed overlays.
Would the incorporation of a reference to the ecological district help that in any way, Mr. Campbell?
Thanks, Councillor Butler. It's probably not needed in this context.
So there's no further discussion on that one. We move on then to subdivision, P12, subdivision design.
Again, that's
It's
just
a correction of
grammatic-
grammar to improve clarity. I know it's off script, Mr. Campbell, but I wonder because of that subdivision, in that space, Mayor Kircher had asked me a question about our rural residential subdivisions and his belief that we had agreed to reduce the areas, but the 1 hectare minimum still applies. Can you just refresh our memories as to how that came about?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we have agreed in the rural residential area, I think it's rural lifestyle now, to reduce the minimum to 5,000 square metres, so half a hectare, and have an average of 1 hectare. So it means that people can have a greater range of sites, not just a cookie cutter 1 hectare blocks everywhere. Particularly in a lot of our areas are sort of steeper gullies and hill parts behind Oamaru. So it means that those areas in the gullies that are not suitable to build, you can have a bigger land area and make use of the flatter parts of the block. So it gives it a few more options there.
No, thank you for that explanation. All right, we shift to temporary activities.
This one's pretty straightforward. The word like wasn't really needed in the end, so we just thought it could be removed. It doesn't take away from the definition or wording.
Yes, you can't have Antonov AN24s just landing at will here at Heather and Yon, Auckland Airport maybe, but not.
The general residential zone.
Mr. Chair, look, I did have a very quick, my concern with this one was it's very specific. It references a particular part of the street, 12 to 27 Chelmsford Street on the road. And I'm wondering whether we should sign it off without seeing the raison d'etre. In other words, the officers have said, we specifically want to rezone that bit. And I'm wondering if the DPR subcommittee thinks it's reasonable to ask why, or be satisfied as to the why before saying yay.
Yeah, again, it's, I guess, twofold here. It's picked up what the spatial plan signalled, and by and large does pick up existing uses that are industrial, you know, Awamoa bins, Black Hawk, Saddlery, those sort of businesses that are along there. It's quite a small area, probably not that great for housing given it's pretty cold and shady through there on the valley floor. But yeah, it's not a huge change from what's there now.
No.
Yeah.
That's fine.
All right, we move to the town centre zone.
Again, it's just trying to make it less restrictive and inadvertent wording there's been picked out.
Councillor Kane.
Yeah, sorry, David, just general knowledge. So what does it mean, building must adjoin the road boundary? So where is the road boundary on the main street?
Yeah, so it'll be where the property boundary hits the legal road boundary. So it's kind of penalising buildings that don't adjoin the boundary, and it's requiring people to get consent where they're building out the back, for instance. So it's just trying to take away that anomaly where it may not create an actual effect that we're trying to address. Yeah.
Everyone happy? We move into general rural zone.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Look, my view is if we've mapped SNAs, then we've mapped SNAs. And this notion that Eco Rule R1, Indigenous Vegetation Clearance outside an SNA may apply to activities within the general rural zone, is essentially an expansion by an undefined extent of the SNA and the rules applicable to it. And I do not believe in the current climate, again citing the proposed reforms and the intentions and the precepts under which they are to be implemented, I don't think we should say yes to this.
I tend to agree, councillor Hopkins, bearing in mind that central government actually gave a directive that future mapping of SNAs was to cease while they were redesigning the RMA. So this may be interpreted as a clandestine way of doing further mapping.
That said, I support those comments.
So I will move.
No, well, we'll just let Mr Campbell respond and then.
Yeah, thanks. I guess it's a bit tricky with this rule because it's basically saying there's a range of permitted activities where Indigenous vegetation clearance is allowed for. And then there's obviously rules that signal where it's triggered. So what we're trying to say is it's not an automatic thing that you're going to be caught by the rule. So the user note's really just flagging, hey, it may apply or it may not. It doesn't take away from the actual rule itself. So it's just trying to be more helpful, I guess, in that respect. It doesn't change the rule applicability.
So that rule, Dave, where's it come from? Is it national standards or is it a district rule or regional rule? Where's that coming from?
Yes, it's our permitted Indigenous vegetation clearance rule for outside of an SNA. So it's basically saying people can do their repair and maintenance of farm tracks, fences, all that sort of thing. And then it goes back to those thresholds that we were talking about earlier for beyond that. So the rule's already there. It's just saying the note is to help people say, well, you may or may not be affected by this.
So those rules are our rules and not necessarily the national rules.
Again, the rules align with the NPS on Indigenous biodiversity, the regional policy statement, that sort of thing. So it's trying to get the right balance there. The user note's basically saying, for clarity, in some cases they may not apply, in some cases they will. So it's not changing the rule, it's already there.
It sounds to me like the planners are having, in the old term, half a bob each way. And we probably need more clarity than that.
I mean, the user note hasn't been put in here, but it will be put in the report to council, so that might help clarify things when you see it in the context, perhaps. So you could agree to proceed with this based on what the user note will say. We haven't actually written it yet.
I accept that, but really, I would see this subcommittee as where the panel beating should be done and we sell council the car. So what happens if it's taken to council and rejected?
Well, there's no huge implication. The rule stands. It just means how people apply it is a bit less clear.
To make another comment, why do we need to use a note if it's in the rule anyway?
Again, it's to help people be clear where it may impact them or it may not. And the user note will give that kind of clarity.
Councillor Hopkins?
Just listening to what Mr Campbell's saying, I would have thought that officers might have contemplated amending the rule rather than applying a user note that potentially is likely to muddy the waters further. I mean, if it's a rule, then the word may should not be applied. The rule will say yes or no and make it clear as to the what and why and where that rule applies. the notion that it's a rule, but it's ambiguous or conditional and may apply but may not, that's like a guideline versus a standard, it seems to me. And either the rule is revisited in order to achieve an outcome that officers deem to be appropriate for us to consider, or we accept this recommendation, which I think is just going to muddy the waters further, and does seem to me to be potentially an extension of a rule relating to Indigenous vegetation clearance outside a significant natural area to an entire zone in a way that would have implications for the plan and for the district.
I tend to agree, Councillor Hopkins. Councillor McCone, you have an opinion?
I do, pretty much the same with what we just heard. This plan has drawn huge lines through huge areas of land that are now apparently, if this goes through, to be rezoned in certain areas. So as you mentioned before, Mr. Chair, we're going for a Bob each way. So to me, it means, for me, and looking at the practical side of things, we need a defined line of where those boundaries are, and everything on the left-hand side of that boundary that's in general rural zone, leave it alone. You've got enough governance over the rest of it. You're starting to interfere again with people's property rights.
Councillor Wackler?
Isn't this primarily driven by what the requirements of the national policy statement are, though, Mr. Campbell, or in relation to the definitions that kind of account for the areas in the policy statement, specifically, there's a very prescriptive list of examples of biodiversity that might be sitting outside of a defined SNA.
I think we're sort of departing a bit from the purpose of this recommendation. In the introduction of this chapter, we have user notes listed. One of them, and we should probably put this in the report, one of them at the end states, please refer to the general approach chapter for more information on the steps plan users should take to determine what rules apply to an activity and to determine the consent status of an activity. All we're seeking to do is clarify that particular rule may or may not apply in the user notes. It doesn't change the rule or how it's applied. It's just saying in these user notes, so people can read the start and go, well, I do or don't need to check it. It's just trying to help plan users a little more. I mean, there's no harm if it's not in there. It's just a helpful suggestion we thought would be useful at that front end of the chapter.
I understand the sentiment, but my concern is that I look at what the intention of the author is versus the intention of a reader down the track. And we only have to look at Te Tiriti to see that 170 odd years later, we're still debating what the intention was. And I totally support the idea of making the notes easier to understand. But in my layman's reading of this, I still tend to think that it suggests that we're defining SNAs that are not clearly defined.
Mr. Campbell, doesn't under Eco R1, doesn't PER 2 kind of say that anyway in terms of the references to the relevant matters?
In a way, yes. So, I mean, it's this is kind of just trying to summarize how that rule works effectively for users. Doesn't change, it's not changing the rule or.
Yeah, I'm not saying I agree with this, set of rules, but I understand how they've come about. And I mean, I don't, based on what's written in here already, I don't think a user note is going to change any outcome.
So reading the mood of the subcommittee, Mr. Campbell, I don't think that there's any support for the officer's recommendation. Is there anyone on the subcommittee who wants to contradict that position?
Just for the record, I'm indifferent. I'm not against it, but I don't think it'll really change anything.
The point I was making was the intention. I actually believe that your indifference is possibly some of us share, but it's what's written in this language that gives a slightly different interpretation. Do you require something more specific, Mr. Campbell? All right. On then to natural features and landscapes, and activity status permitted. It's again just a rewording.
Yes, just to be clear that the rule status in the second column from the right has the or, and then the 2, 3, and 4 are all and clauses, and we're just trying to align that with where it's a restricted discretionary activity. It's the same alignment effectively, so it doesn't change anything in the rule. It's just making sure that that's like for like when you go to the next category.
Yep.
It's a more a technical thing.
Does anyone have any questions on that one? All right.
How do we, yeah, how would you recommend that we address the recommendations from page 12 to page 21 onwards? Is there a portmanteau resolution?
I believe that we could, in a generic sense, say that the subcommittee has given direction to the planning staff on each of the issues examined. Do you need something more specific than that, Mr. Campbell?
I think going back to the earlier point to say whether you support going to council to submit or not submit, because there was a couple that were not submit.
Yes.
And maybe single those out might be the easiest way so that the rest are submit.
Yeah. So that there's those two earlier historic ones that we did. Possibly we need then to do the same with the additional wording around the SNAs. If the subcommittee felt that that was dead in the water or not, and the rest, we would be happy for that to come to council. Mr. Campbell?
Just with the exception of the Indigenous vegetation one where it was a variation, what is a specific recommendation?
I think that's been moved.
Yeah.
That was moved.
Yeah.
With regard to the ones that we said we didn't want us to submit on, they involved, I thought I had moved, maybe I didn't. That involved no submission on HHH 111, HH 223, and what we don't. the ones where the heritage consultant is currently working, as pieces of information, they remain on the table, but so there was that one. There was an amendment to the terminology regarding dry grassland character and vegetation character, and no submission to be made on the addition of a user note clarifying eco rule R1.
Just to cut you off at the pass, councillor Hopkins, we do have our governance advisor online who's been taking the minutes today, and she's outlined what hasn't been supported in her minutes, so it will be there for the record.
In which case I would move that DPR subcommittee recommends to council responses to officers' recommendations contained in today's report as agreed. Yeah.
Do we have a seconder for that?
Well, I'm moving these are the ones from under the blue line, so
And you actually don't need to outline them because the minutes clearly show what.
I'm just moving that DPR subcommittee recommends to council the implementation of its recommendations regarding officer recommendations. It's recommendations regarding officer recommendations as contained in today's agenda.
All right. That's been seconded by councillor McCone, moved by councillor Hopkins. I'll put it. All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you for your work on that. I just want to raise another issue while we're here as a committee. And that is in light of the information that is coming to us from central government, I wonder whether it would be prudent to ask staff to prepare a paper for us to examine 3 possible scenarios with the district plan. And that is to continue the notified plan as it is. Secondly, to progress chapters relating to non-contentious matters and ensure that land's available for housing, but withdraw certain chapters that are contentious, particularly in the rural zone. Or thirdly, park the whole plan for a period of 6 months while we await the new legislation to catch up. One member of the committee who's not with us did express that as withdraw the whole plan. I don't believe that that is an option, but actually signalling to the community that we want to ensure that the intentions of central government are absolutely plain to us. We could, I believe, postpone the plan for a set period of time, waiting for that to catch up. So I'll open that up to any comment from the members of the subcommittee, and Mr. Campbell and Mr. Cook, I welcome your comments as well. Councillor Blackler.
Just for total clarity about what's being suggested here. is the idea that we're effectively just pushing pause on the process. So
Yes,
it kind of stagnates at this point until we get clarity around central government direction.
yeah, so look, we need to be careful in this conversation in the public arena that we're not predetermining anything. All I'm flagging is that there are three options, I believe, that we should seek as quickly as possible staff advice, and that is the continued progression as it stands, the possible parking of part of the plan, or parking the whole plan for a limited time.
But just to clarify, it would just be basically in a holding pattern at proposed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think it's entirely appropriate for us to ask for a report of that nature. It might also be appropriate for us as elected members to perhaps signal if there is consensus and agreement, a preference, should we have one, for which outcome we might prefer. I noticed that the legislation, or we've been told that the pivotal document with regard to this plan should be in front of the House in September. So whether we want to pause everything for 6 months, particularly when there are really genuine improvements and changes proposed in urban areas, notably in relation to housing rules that are intended, and I acknowledge there is debate as to their efficacy, but the intention of the changes is to make housing more affordable and to offer a wider range of housing choices, which are key issues of concern to the community here and to Parliament as well. So my personal preference would be to pause the contentious chapters rather than the whole plan, but whether we should signal a preference, if indeed one is held by the committee, is a matter that we could possibly discuss today. There is an additional matter that I believe, since you have broached the question of pausing the plan, that I also would like to discuss once we've canvassed this.
Mr. Campbell?
Yeah, just a matter of clarity, or a couple of points of clarity. We need to know what the contentious matters or chapters are. We've had very few submissions at this stage. And whether the report, I assume, would go to council, because council makes the decision on the
Yes,
plan anyways.
correct. Yeah,
Or
yeah.
whether you want an intermediate step with the subcommittee or not.
Well, I think that that you're correct. The decision lays with council, but there are members of the governance group who have not sat in on this and would be expecting us to give them guidance. So it may well be that it would be useful to come back to the DPR before going to the whole of council. But I'm conscious of the fact we don't want to make this any harder than it has to be. And personally, I don't know that, well, I don't believe that we need outside advice. We have enough trust in the expertise internally to help us with a steer on this issue. Councillor McCann?
Look, I support that. There's a whole lot of stuff out there, and it's already been alluded to in previous meetings, that we're just unaware of what's coming down the track. And I, for one, feel totally uninformed on some of the decisions we have to make, and I'd like to be more informed on those decisions. So, and therefore, I would be quite happy to park it up.
I think, sorry, Mr. Cook, the one thing, going back, Councillor Hopkins, you mentioned about, we know from the advice from Ministry for the Environment, they have to have this information in front of Cabinet by September. That's going to take a process. It's going to be longer. We could try and gamble and go, for example, in the pause space, whether it be a partial or totally, we're going to pause for a longer period. I believe we'd be better served to take a shorter period and revisit it as the information comes to hand than hamstring ourselves. But again, that's open to debate. Mr. Cook?
Thank you. Couple of things just clarified. Do you consider it's best that it's a decision paper, or would it be best the first stage to be a workshop where things can be discussed and debated more? We've already got an indication from one councillor of a preference, which is a little concerning when we to even write the paper. We'd rather write the paper without any sort of level of determination. Yes. There is a bit of preparation work in this. So we've got the preparation for the council paper on what's been decided today. And we are running on fairly tight resources at the moment, so that it's not an insubstantial piece of work. And I also just want to clarify that the process that we are currently in, does that continue until we have this workshop meeting, whatever we decide on? I.e. we're in a statutory time frame of consultation, which finishes on the 9th of May. And is that intended to continue as it is at the moment?
Well, that's one of the questions that we would seek your advice on, because I would imagine that somewhere along the line, if a decision was made different to the path that we're currently on, and we could leave ourselves open to challenge in the fact that, oh, we didn't submit because we thought you were going to do X, Y, and Z, but that didn't happen. So yeah, I'm cognizant of the pressures on staff, that if we're going to have a workshop, and I personally welcome that suggestion, it needs to be as quickly as possible, so that whatever decision is made, it's clear and obvious to everyone participating in the plan. Councillor Hopkins.
Well, I think it's fair to say that officers have been thinking about this as well as elected members, and that I think there are some options in front of us for consideration, in front of all of us for consideration, and that some of those options have already been sort of informally discussed. And there is clearly a mood in the community for there to be at least an extension of the submission period, on the basis that the time needed and the expense involved in actually preparing submissions and detailing arguments that might challenge objectives, policies and rules in the proposed district plan are on the basis of actual experience since 1 March become clear are in fact going to involve more time and more cost than had been perhaps previously anticipated. So I think my view is the argument for pushing pause in part or in whole is gaining traction. I think the idea of a workshop ASAP is the best approach, and I'm not sure that it should be too problematic, given what I've said about the fact that people are clearly already thinking about this and have developed some thoughts. The key thing, I think, is to bring the whole council into the workshop, and possibly even consider some public participation, because I think it's a matter that may, and I do underline that, it is a situation where that level of participation may be warranted, just in terms of teasing out some of the particularities of the matters I've talked about in relation to time taken to prepare submissions and the cost involved.
Appreciate the point of view, councillor, but I believe that the buck stops with us. And we need to deal with these issues first. And the fact is, we do have a huge amount of information coming across our bows. Mayor Kircher forwarded another one from the ECAN presentation yesterday. So I would expect that everyone on this subcommittee will be well versed with what's going on and would be able to engage in a positive manner with staff with what options are available. Mr. Cook, did you have further to add?
Yeah, a couple of points there. If we go for a workshop, then workshops by definition are public workshops. Any briefings are public excluded. Curious as to explore the notion that you talk about public participation in a workshop and what that would look like, whether that's a form of submission process that public are then going to start doing, because that takes a lot of coordinating, that takes a lot of organising. You referred to the ECAN presentation yesterday. At the ECAN presentation, both Mackenzie District Council and Timaru District Council, who were in a similar point to us, perhaps slightly more advanced, asked the presenters whether they should pause their district plan. The feedback given was the recommendation was to continue in the process you're in, but we can incorporate that sort of advice in the workshop papers. Also remind councillors that next week is Good Friday, I believe. The following week is Good Friday and Anzac Day. Your council agendas are very full with long-term plan decisions and deliberations, etc. The event will likely to have to be scheduled for a different day.
Yep, no.
And we have a number of officers on leave between Easter and Anzac Day.
Yeah, fully appreciate that timing is not particularly a friend of ours at this time. And I also take on board the workload of other issues that both staff and council are dealing with. Mr. Campbell?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of other points. In terms of the submission period and process, there's people that have already made submissions, there are people already preparing submissions. We have to be very careful of how the RMA deals with that aspect. It's a process matter. And our legal advice is that any process matters relating to that aspect should be handled by an independent commissioner. We can appoint them as an interim to deal with any of those process responses. Effectively, council has made a decision on the notification period and was extended greater than the 40 working days because of Easter and Anzac and so on. There was resistance, I think, at some stage to make it too long. So we're just going to be mindful of the balance of what the RMA requires, not holding up, avoiding undue delay, that sort of thing. We've got a 2-year window to issue decisions from the notification date prescribed by the Act. Any departure from that needs a ministerial approval. So we've got a range of things process related that we have to be mindful of. We are in a locked in process under the RMA. So any requests of that nature need to be handled very carefully and probably have some sort of legal input. We certainly can provide information for a workshop on those matters raised, but I think the other matters need to be dealt with separately outside of this subcommittee.
Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, look, let's face it, it's a critical, vital and important matter. If we have to have a meeting or a workshop on a day that we might otherwise not necessarily schedule council commitments, so be it. I mean, that's exactly what's happening today. And there is, in my view, an additional reason why we should contemplate pause, and that is a matter that has been discussed informally and generated huge amounts of, well, considerable amounts of concern in the community already. And that is that the document that was notified on the 1st of March is not, and I absolutely insist this to be the case, is not the document council thought it was notifying when it voted on these matters on the 17th of December 2024. And the minutes and the recording of that meeting indicate certain undertakings to include content that is not in the plan at the moment. And in my view, that in and of itself warrants consideration of the grounds for pause. Because there is an issue here of potential breach of faith with ourselves and with the community. And we need to be absolutely clear as to what the document that the community, well, we need to be absolutely clear that we are either satisfied with the document as it is, or we want the document that we told the community last December they were going to get notified is the document that is notified. And
Councillor, I don't want to shut down the conversation, but there is a process we need to deal with here. The first thing is we've asked staff to come up with not solutions, but options for us to look at, both in terms of how we examine the options that I outlined, and also where we go in terms of the logistics. The issue that you're talking about, it was my intention at the end of this meeting for us to have an informal discussion about with staff, because we have already asked for research on that matter, and there may well be a difference of opinion, and I don't intend that it be litigated in this space. No, I'm now going to Councillor Blackler, who has hand up, and I'll come back to you so you can think about.
I was going to ask along the same lines as what you ruled.
Oh, so just for the, no, hang on, Councillor, for the sake that Councillor Blackler didn't have his microphone on, but what he said was the chairman was correct in what he had ruled. So.
look, absolutely. I'm very pleased to hear that you said that is your intention. I do not intend further to litigate the matter. I was simply trying to suggest that if there is to be a workshop regarding causation of the plan in whole or in part, that the matters to which I have referred actually are legitimately, potentially part of that workshop. And based on what you have said, I would signal that I won't be moving something that I had intended to move regarding regarding a response as to the notified plan at the moment. But the one thing I would say is if we are to have this informal conversation, and I'm perfectly comfortable that we do that, I would like to see some public comment from yourself at the conclusion of it, because I mean, there is considerable public interest in this, and it's well over a month and a half since the plan was notified and since these concerns were first expressed by members of the community. So if it is possible for that to be considered, I would be grateful.
I'm certainly happy to act on behalf of the subcommittee if that is the outcome of our informal discussion. Councillor McCain?
Look, it's all been said in various ways, and I just go back, this is a district plan, it's for the betterment of the district, and to make those decisions, we've got to be fully informed and think of the consequences of the decisions we're making. We must also bear in mind that the first long-term or district plan was in the late nineties and early 2000s. It's taken 20 years to turn around and get another one. So how long is it going to take the next step? My point being, is it a 10-year plan or a 30-year plan? And on that basis, the laws that we pass or are asked to pass and everything else that stand up as in a court of law may be there for 30 years. So we've got to get it right.
Any closing comments, Mr. Campbell?
Probably just to respond to Councillor McCone's point, it is a valid one in that a plan set now is anticipated to be for 10 years. That's the review cycle for a plan. Because you commence a review within 10 years doesn't mean you have a new plan straight away, as we know. We do know that the signal is that any RM reform changes are going to be sped up in terms of implementation. So it's unlikely that this plan will last 10 years in its current form, but whatever new plan gets created under the new regime is in that same 10-year cycle.
Thank you. Thank you for your participation this morning. Thank you for those members of the public who have an interest and attended or watched online. And like the good soap opera of Days of Our Lives, we will be back at a future date. Thank you.